Welcome to the second channel. I'm going to have a little bit of fun here voicing over myself. Doesn't this look really cool? Let's make a knife. And I'm going to show you some of the how-to features in this. So yeah, you can tell that my lips aren't in sync with what I'm saying, but that's okay because this is the second channel and I'm going to have a little bit of fun today. So I'm starting with a scrap of curly spalted white oak, and I've got several of these scraps that have been in my possession for a while. And for little things like this, they are phenomenal, and the amount of color in them is just... they're beautiful pieces of wood, and there's a bunch of these that I just want to hold on to. And you probably have a box of scraps like that if you've been working with wood for a while. And yes, I have a box of all sorts of different scraps. So after laying them out and tracing out the design of the steel a little bit larger than it needs to be, then I can come in here to the bird's mouth. And this is basically just a raised panel with a hole in it that makes it much easier to use the coping saw or fret saw to get in fairly close on small pieces. I'm staying away from the line because I'm going to be able to clean them up in the future. And right now I just want to cut them out to the right shape so they can be glued on. I need to stabilize these a little bit as they are spalted, and there's some voids I'd like to fill a little bit. It's also really nice for knife handles as it stabilizes them so they don't move as much. So if you have them attached to the steel, which doesn't move much at all, the wood doesn't then move in comparison to the steel, so they don't want to splinter off in the future. So stabilization of knife scales is a fantastic idea, and something you'll see through a lot of the industry. So I'm using a vacuum chamber, and I have an entire video on how I do this if you want to see that. I'll try and leave a link to that down below. The vacuum chamber sucks all of the air out of the wood, so when you put the pressure back on, then it forces the fluid into the wood. And for the fluid, I am using cactus juice. But not today. Oops. Yeah. I'm missing my tinfoil. Apparently lost it somewhere. So I'm going to try using the saran wrap. Didn't work exactly how I wanted, but it worked sufficient enough for the project. So I'm just going to wrap them up in some saran wrap, put them on paper, and then put them in the oven to cook for a while. You'll want to read the instructions on your stabilizing fluid to find out how long you need to cook it and what to do with it. But this little cooking oven works great for small pieces like this. As you can see, the saran wrap melted. Not unexpected, but it worked pretty well. Actually, it worked as well as could be expected. So I now have pieces that are stabilized and ready to work with. I need to smooth out one side so that I can glue them to the steel of the handle. With the saran wrap and stabilizing fluid, that left a lot of junk on the outside. And it looks really bad, but once you take a few passes with a plane, you get down to that wood, and it's this beautifully smooth, almost plastic-like texture that can be cut in any direction. You don't have to worry about it ripping out. And for this spalted curly white oak, which is one of the hardest woods to work with, this is phenomenal because now you can plane it in any direction and not worry about tear out. For the adhesion to the steel, I'm going to scratch up the steel with a file. This will allow the epoxy to set into the metal a little bit, and I'm going to do the same thing with the wood because this was stabilized. I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy to glue them together, and we are ready to go. Now, the first time I did this, I ran into a few problems of actually breaking off. I used it too quickly. It's 5 minutes working time. It's not 5 minutes of actual in time for it to harden. So the first thing I do is, after letting it sit for a while, I think it was like 6 hours or so, I can drive in the first of the 2 pins. This then gives me the exact location for the second one, and we can drive that in and then let this sit some more. And I want to let it cure completely before I then drill the other side. Now that we have that in there, we can clamp it up, set it aside, and then come back. The next thing we need to do when we come back is drive out the pins, because the pins are just there to hold it in the right place, but we still need to drill holes to the other side. So for this, I grabbed a punch. Actually, I think I need to use a finishing nail because my punch was a bit too big for these. Yeah. Can drive out the pin, and then we can start running epoxy on the other side. And for this, I decided to use a longer epoxy, West Systems epoxy. So one side is 5 minute, the other side is West System. And yeah, you live and you learn. I've done a few handles, but I haven't done that many, so this isn't something I'm really comfortable with, but I've done enough that I can get around with it. So the next thing I want to do is drill out the pins. So I'm coming from the first side we did, drilling down through and into the wood on the other side. And this then allows us to drive in the pin all the way through. I applied a little bit of epoxy to that as well, so that it stays in place. Do the same thing on the other end, and everything is in place. Now we set this aside for a long time to dry. I want to make sure the epoxy is completely cured before I start taking the rasps and file to it, because those put a lot of horizontal pressure on the scales. So clamp it up, set it aside. You really need about 24 hours with West System, but I ended up leaving it for several days actually. I think it was almost a week. With the 4-in-hand rasp, we can start shaping this down. Now this process seems like it takes a long time, and it feels like it kind of, but really it was only about 20-30 minutes to get it to a rough shape. I'm going to start with some rough rasps and round it to a general round shape. I'm not caring particularly about getting it close. I just want to take the rough edges off and make it feel a little bit better in the hand. The 4-in-hand actually makes that really nice because you have a rasp on one side and the file on the other, so you can smooth out fairly quickly, bouncing back and forth between the two. On some of these I'll use a heavier rasp, and some of them I'll use a lighter rasp, some of them I'll use the Shinto, and I'll go back and forth and use different things in different places and round it all over. Again, this seems like it takes a lot of time, and we got a lot of video clips, so it looks like it takes a lot of time, but it was really only about 20-30 minutes or so. On the back side, I want to be a little more careful with this, because if I put too much horizontal pressure on it, there is a possibility of ripping the scales off. And so I'm going to be using a very light pressure with the big rasp. As we get on to finer and finer rasps and files, it becomes less of an issue because they don't grip into the wood as much. They're more smoothing it. But now you can start to see the figure coming out, and this is where things really start to get exciting. I'm moving down to a finer file and a finer file until I get to the really fine file. I can have a little bit of fun here, and you can see I'm checking it occasionally, making sure it's balanced one side to the other. It's very easy to take more off of one side and then it looks lopsided one side to the other. If you take your time and go back and forth between them, you'll make sure that it's nice and easy. Make sure it feels good in the hand, and occasionally I'll grab it and I'll feel it and make sure there aren't any burrs, and continue on. And here, this is, I think, the finest file I'm going to use. And then I'm going to move on to sandpaper. I don't usually use sandpaper, but in this case, because it's stabilized, I want to take it up to an extremely high grit. And for that, I'm going to use micro mesh, which goes up to like 16,000 grit. It's incredibly high. And I'm just marching through the different colors, and each one takes a little higher, wet sanding it down, and allows you to get rid of all of the pores, any problem in there. I'm wiping it off in between so I don't leave any of the coarse texture from a coarser grit onto a finer grit. Then once that has been polished all the way down, we can dip it in some boiled linseed oil. And this is where the magic is like, oh yeah, I'm excited. I just love how that grain pops, and with the contrast of the steel, it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm really happy here. So we can wipe it off, and then we can put on some paste wax. For this, I'm just going to be using the normal Minwax paste wax. Rub it on, let it sit for an hour or so, and then I can come back and wipe it off and actually buff it in. And this is where you get that really nice raw wood shine. And I'm just absolutely in love with how this came out. Feels really good in the hand and is beautiful to play with. Only thing I have to do is give it a little bit of stropping, sharpen it up, and it's ready to give away. And I am really, really happy with how this came out. Keeping those scraps on hand, I don't use them that often, but every now and then that piece comes out where it's like, oh yes. And yes, I am happy. Oh, stink. I forgot to record an outro too. Oh well. This is where I tell you to go take a look at the other video, which is on the main channel, which you probably have seen if you've come to this one, because this is the second channel. Had a little bit of fun working with that one and doing a little bit more of an artistic build, and it was a good video. I'm happy with it. But here we can give it to Luke, and he was very pleased to get it, as it was very odd. He brought it to me from his father-in-law, who made the knife, and now his father-in-law contacted me and sent me the sheath and said, hey, can you give this to Luke? So it was kind of a cool way to bring it around, and I'm very pleased that I was able to do this on the show. So I hope you liked this build. It was a fun one for me, and I'm looking forward to doing more in the future. So that's about it for now, and until next time, have a wonderful day. You know, some people say hand tools are an old-fashioned, but I really think that they have they're cutting-edge technology.